I mean, we happen to have this week visitors from CISA. This is Silke Weinfurtner and Sotiriou Thomas, and also Charis Apostolatou from Athens. With these two groups, we have a kind of set up collaborations. I mean, with CISA, we have an official memorandum for collaboration, etc. And with Athens, the group of Charis, we have their exchange program running for the last 2-3 years. So, using this opportunity, we decided that we organize all the lectures since are all about black holes, and starting from black holes in the lab, black holes in general, and also how you can test gravity theory using several solutions for black holes. The first speaker is Silke Weinfurtner, Silke got her first degree in Munich, then her PhD was in New Zealand, in Canberra, Wellington University, then in British Columbia, second postdoc, and now, first postdoc in British Columbia, and then now she's senior researcher in CISA. Silke working, she started originally with more mathematical approach to black holes, but now she's involved as theoretician in various experiments that you can do in the lab proving properties of black holes. So it's a kind of exciting stuff, which is not only astrophysics, but general physics.
Thank you, first Kostas, thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. So let me start to explain it. So I'm going to present an experiment. This room reminds me a little bit about my experimental lab. It's all the pipes and the noise. So what you're seeing here, that's some of our experimental data. And in fact, what you're looking at is the experimental verification of Hawking radiation. So you see here, I will explain positive and negative norm models converted by an effective divided horizon. And I will explain all of these things which I just said. The experiment was carried out at the University of British Columbia. It was a joint collaboration between the Civil Engineering Department, so Greg Lawrence and Ted Tedford, and from the gravity side it was Bill Unruh and Matt Penrice and myself. So Ted Matt is now doing his PhD at CISA, not at CISA, at ICTP. He's joined the group starting a new experiment. He now is at CISA, and Ted will join us for the next 4 months also to work on the new experiments. So, black hole physics in laboratory, how is that possible? So Kostas asked me to give, and since this is a collaboration between the University of Tübingen and CISA, let me tell you a little bit about my general line of research and what is all about. So behind my research, there is this idea to test various aspects of quantum gravity in tabletop experiments using analog systems. So why do I propose to use analog systems instead of studying the real world? Well, in quantum gravity, first of all, we don't have a definite theory of quantum gravity, but also within more established things like I will explain in a second, semi-classical gravity, there are some aspects or ideas that are hard or impossible to access observationally or experimentally. So the idea is that some of these features repeat themselves in other systems such as fluids, superfluids, quantum matter systems, or also appear in quantum information, and we can use that in theoretical, numerical, and experimental studies to get some insight into quantum gravity and vice versa. So in particular, what I'm working on is within quantum gravity, semi-classical gravity, that is classical and quantum field theory on curved spacetimes. And also in quantum gravity, in particular, I'm now interested, I also worked on more things, but I'm now interested in discrete quantum gravity theories and also effective field theories. So what I'm mainly going to talk about here is to propose to present one particular experiment, and that is concerned with the black hole radiation process, Hawking radiation, and this is this experiment. In CISA now we are setting up another experiment to test super radiant scattering from rotating black holes, and I will have a few slides about that. I'm also working on cosmological particle production, and that we're looking into the Bose-Einstein condensates, parametrically excited Bose-Einstein condensates, as another analogy between particle production and our universe. And the last thing, this is a new idea, which I worked on with people in Innsbruck, Hans Grigor, and so forth, to find systems like information systems that have similarities with a particular variant of discrete quantum gravity. And the general idea is that I have a master's student and a PhD student working with me on the experiments. Now for the next few months we also have a postdoc joining us on the experiment, and I have 16 external collaborators helping me to work on this project objectives. So let's start from the basic. So semi-classical quantum gravity, in particular I'm focusing on field theory, quantum and classical field theory, and world spacetimes. So the general idea is that I'm saying, okay, supposedly that my gravitational field I can consider to be classical, I don't have to quantize it, and I only quantize my matter fields, but the idea is that whatever the quantum process, whatever I do with my quantum fields, is small enough, is negligible in the sense that you don't have to include back reaction effects onto the gravitational field. So how does it work? Field theory and curved spacetime, let me become very trivial. So some of you are not working in gravity, so let me explain what is quantum field theory and curved spacetime in a nutshell. So everyone knows if you have a wave propagating on a flat spacetime, everybody knows the standard wave equation here. Of course, I can also, from a field theoretical point of view, I can say this is simply a massless minimally coupled Klein-Gordon scalar field here. And if I introduce my flat spacetime now to Minkowski metric, and I can rewrite this wave equation in this very compact way using the Minkowski metric here. Now, how does this wave look like if you propagate on a general curved spacetime geometry? Well, you do this minimal substitution, you just say, well, let me replace the Minkowski spacetime with a general curved spacetime geometry, where now in GIB here, each entry in GIB are functions of space and time, and then I can study how waves propagating on a general gravitational field, for example, on a black hole, rotating black hole, or in an expanding universe. Of course, when you want to quantize this in theory, this is very simple, right? You can simply put the hat on this operator here, and then you have a quantum field theory on curved spacetime. However, the idea is that whatever I'm doing here will not influence the Einstein equation, so whatever is in the stress energy tensor, if I don't have to include the back reaction onto the Einstein tensor onto the gravitational field. So, and this actually opens the door once you make this validity with where back reaction effects can be neglected. If you look at quantum field theory in curved spacetime, there are so-called analog gravity system or effective gravity, or immersion spacetime is also referred to, and it summarizes some systems where if I derive the equation of motion for linear perturbation in the systems, then I can rewrite in a very compact way the equation of motion of the small fluctuation in systems, which is precisely the wave equation on a general curved spacetime background. And this GIB now is referred to as the effective acoustic immersion metric tensor, which is supplied by the background. These components here now are the propagation speed of the excitation and the background flow in my system. So, what kind of systems have this behavior? So there is a very broad class of systems like electromagnetic wave-type fluids, ultra-cold gas bosons and fermions, where you can have such a behavior. In particular, the first example found by Bill Unruh about 30 years ago started with fluid dynamics. He looked at the continuity equation or the equation of state, and he linearized and managed to rewrite small perturbations. He focused on sound waves in this way. So the assumption he made is, of course, that you're working with an inviscid, irrotational, incompressible fluid flow. So how can this work? How can you understand that without looking into mathematics? So if you have a fluid flow. And let's assume we're having the flow speeding up from the left to the right. So here in the first thing, let's assume that the flow is 0. And I look at sound waves or surface waves, how they propagate in the system. So imagine I start with small perturbations. If the background flow is at rest, perturbations propagate equally fast up or downstream. I mean, in all directions, I should say. There's nothing downstream when there's zero flow. However, then, when you speed up, you have some non-zero background flow, and you look at your perturbations, of course, the downstream waves propagate faster than the upstream one. Now imagine you can speed up this background flow, this river, to the extent where the background flow equals the propagation velocity. Then, of course, if I have a small perturbation here, nothing can propagate upstream, everything will propagate downstream. So here we have a region where if the only means of communication is by sending these sound waves or surface waves, then here we have causally disconnected areas. If I'm downstream here beyond this line, which we refer to as acoustic horizon if you talk of sound waves, or effective horizons if you talk of surface waves, then if you're in this region, you cannot send signals upstream, while if you're upstream, you can signal downstream. This is an effective black hole horizon. Now, so you can set up in a simple way these effective horizons as seen by small fluctuations in the system. So what can we use that for? So this analogy is a stronger mathematical analogy. There's a broad class of systems, and immediately there's this question, can I use that? Or basically, Bill's first paper was, he said, experimental black hole evaporation, question mark. So can you use this system to test some of the features occurring around effective horizons? So features like black hole evaporation, super radiant scattering, I will explain that, and also cosmological particle horizon. Now, the idea is that, of course, that these analog systems give the possibility for experimental verification of the generality of the UV independence of these effects within the quantum field theory for spacetimes. So the idea is, if I have an analog gravity system, perhaps if I look at sound waves, I have this analogy, but if I go to shorter and shorter distances, clearly this analogy breaks down. There's a cutoff in the system, smallest excitation than I can excite, and also the dispersion relation for sound waves is not linear, it's sublinear. So the idea is that when you have these analog gravity systems, they are ideal models because they deviate. At short scales, they're different. And since we don't know what the full quantum gravity theory is, this gives us the opportunity to test really the dependence on the short scale behavior in the system. And also what the idea is that, whatever this equation of motions, they all look the same for an electromagnetic waveguide or for sound waves in water. And the idea is that whatever what is the actual system, it doesn't matter. So that is this universality. So the idea is to verify Hawking radiation. To do that, you always have to ask yourself, what is this effect I want to see in the lab? So the first question we have to ask ourselves, what really is Hawking radiation? And of course, also when you set up, you go through all this effort of setting up an actual experiment. Is there a theoretical reason why there are some doubts that black holes evaporate? And last but not least, what is the ideal system to set up such an experiment? So, a very naive picture, which I don't particularly like much, is this idea of this paired creation. I took this picture here from Roger Penrose's popular science book, which in the middle here, this middle line is a singularity. This tube around here is the event horizon here around this black hole. And here, these points, these little circles here indicate that the quantum vacuum is not empty all the time. You have this particle-antiparticle pair creation. And at the black hole, the idea is these are separated, and as it's referred to the negative normals, or negative energy, sometimes referred to as falling into the black hole, and the other one, the positive normal, is emitted away. So these pair particle-antiparticle pairs are getting separate. Now this is a very misleading picture I find it's very hard to define particles if you're in this in the gravitational field around the black hole. In the same sense, it's difficult to define plane waves near the black hole since you have no globally defined ground state here. So let's try to understand Hawking radiation as a simple scattering process and see how that works. So the way I look at Hawking radiation is to say, okay, I have a black hole, I have a boundary here, which is my image horizon, and I have a potential outside, the gravitational field. And I look at my field modes outside the black hole, and I have some field modes inside the black hole. Usually people talk about right and left moving modes. So let's maybe not look at it this way. So if this is some potential, I have some scattering with this potential. Let's say I have some things on this side here which fall into the potential and come out again, and the same here. Now if it's an elastic scattering process, there should be some conserved quantity. And of course, everything that goes inside this potential should be equal to everything that comes outside. Turns out, if you look at the wave equation, what you find is that there is a conserved quantity indeed, and that's the particle current. The particle current is just the amplitude of the field modes squared the effective frequency and the Bloom velocity of the mode. And what you can see is then, if you calculate that for a black hole, first of all, in a black hole, if this is a special boundary, meaning nothing can escape, I simply don't have this outgoing mode. There's nothing falling into the potential from the side. And if I look at this equation, what I see, I imagine the field mode, I normalize that to be 1, what's going into the potential. Nothing is coming from this side, there's a 0. And on the other side here, I can calculate, this is what's referred to as alpha squared, is a Kolyubov coefficients, and this is a beta squared. The problem is here that this thing, this beta squared, beta omega squared, comes with a minus sign. So meaning, it seems like if it ends with a minus here, it's the same as if I would have added here with a plus. So effectively, it acts as a source. And what this means is actually, if you look at this equation here, that alpha squared minus beta squared is equal to 1. But what this also means is alpha squared is bigger than 1. So black holes are field amplifiers, nothing else. They are linear phase and sensitive field amplifiers. And what is the famous, how did Hawking associate the temperature to this black hole? Well, he calculated the ratio of how much falls into this black hole, how much is this J capital B here versus this J small b here, so how much falls into the black hole, how much gets emitted away. And he found out that that is proportional, that is e to the minus 2 pi omega over GH, where GH is the surface gravity at the effective horizon. Now this is very much looks like a Boltzmann distribution, and indeed you can compare that to a Boltzmann distribution. In this sense, you can associate temperature T to the black hole, which is directly proportional to the surface gravity. So this is in a nutshell Hawking radiation. It's an elastic scattering process, which is simply a field amplifier. Now, this is a very important aspect of this talk when we explain this experiment. They are linear, classical, and quantum field amplifiers, and I want to explain that in detail. So first of all, black holes, we've just discussed it. Forget about a black hole, complicated gravitational object. It's just this field amplifier. It takes whatever it sucks, some fluctuation from outside. Let's not discuss if they're quantum or classical at that stage. Just say whatever is outside, it sucks it up, spits something out, and it has higher particle current. It's extract particle current, normal energy from this black hole. Now this particle amplifier doesn't work with some power plug, external power source. All the energy this amplifier takes, it takes from its mass. It has stored some gravitation as a mass. And by amplifying these field modes, the black hole is losing its mass. It's slowly evaporating away. So, black hole radiation, how can I, in order to detect it and say I conclusively seen Hawking radiation, I need to know all the essential features. So I will present an experiment where you can see that this is a pair creation process. It follows a Boltzmann distribution, and this Boltzmann distribution is determined by the surface gravity, which you should also in some way be able to calculate in an alternative way. So that is a bit of strength because I haven't said so much. Everybody always says, well, Hawking is quantum. And the question really is, what do you mean with quantum? So first of all, if you have a real-life system, have a tabletop experiment, it's different than from doing a theory paper where you just take an operator, put the head on it, and there's nothing else. Now this is an experiment, and in the experiment, if I look at this in our particular system, for example, you can always stimulate the system, which is a stimulated wave or whatever stimulated field mode. If you wouldn't do that, you have classical vibration from the system, classical noise. Now, if you don't have that, then you're down to the thermal noise, and if you want to go down to the quantum noise, you have to eliminate and reduce the thermal noise. So the question here is, and this is what I will show you, is that there is some trick that simplifies to the detection of Hawking radiation. And that is, as I said before, black holes are linear phase insensitive amplifier, meaning the more you send in, the more is coming out. So what we're doing, we do an experiment here, and we show that here, Hawking's law applies beautifully. The problem, of course, which we refer to as a stimulated black hole emission. Of course, when you do that, you lose something. And what you lose is that if I were not to send anything in, if there's no other noise than quantum noise, then you talk about the spontaneous black hole evaporation, as everybody usually refers to this quantum process. And the only difference is, as long as you're in the linear regime, the only difference is that when I'm here, then I have quantum correlations. So the thing that falls into the black hole and the other thing that comes out is entangled. And that's one of the new things I'm working on, because in Bose-Einstein condensate system we look at the controlled creation of entangled quasi-particles in these analog gravity systems. And an important question you need to answer is, where is this borderline? How much would I have to cool down my system so that I can see that? And you can actually calculate that, and we've got some very nice results for that. So, why do we care? Let me just motivate that many people say, black holes evaporate, why do we evaporate? So if you look at the black hole evaporation, it's the photons emitted from the black hole, infinitely far away from the black hole, and you would trace them back in time where they originated, and you go back and back towards the horizon, what you see is that they get blue shifted. And they get blue shifted to energy scales beyond the Planck scale. Now at that energy scales, we don't necessarily should trust quantum fields or in curved space. So one of the questions we have when black holes really evaporate is because perhaps the zero we're using to describe it is not sufficient. Maybe we need a full quantum gravity zero. So now these analog systems, of course, at short scales look very, very different. So the idea is, if in these analog systems, it doesn't matter what is really the underlying structure, you do get some insight about the generality, universality of black hole evaporation. And what we want to see is that when we set up this experiment, we want to have a system which is robust against all these modifications. Now, scientific goal is the conclusive detection of black hole evaporation. We're using the spontaneous effect because I would argue later on the temperatures of this black hole, this particular, is 10 to the minus 12 Kelvin, and we're doing this experiment at room temperature, but I never measure temperature. I'm just sending in more gets converted, and I can measure that signal. So we have a spontaneous black hole emission, We have to be in a regime where I'm in a linear regime, so the amplitudes of my field excitations are small enough to not involve the full fluid dynamics in our case. So we are in a semi-classical quantum gravity without backvector. And then last but not least, if you stimulate the system, it turns out to be either in our system we have black and white hole horizon, both are stable. Because we stimulate it, it's easier to stimulate the white hole horizon. If they are stable, which they are in these systems, then Hawking law applies to both the black and the white hole horizon. So what is a suitable analog gravity system to carry out these experiments? Well, we're looking at surface waves and open channel flows with a varying depth. So it's a very simple trivial system studied over centuries in fluid dynamics, in civil engineering and oceanography. We're making the assumption that the system that is stationary, irrotational, incompressible, and viscid, of course in any actual experiment that is not completely given. So the idea is that we try to suppress as good as possible these effects. So, and if we have a system like that, imagine you have this open channel flow, I will show you a picture about that later. you see that I now have a background flow. I have a constant flow rate. I have a pump that with a constant flow rate pumps water through its open channel flow. And of course, the velocity is equal to the flow rate divided by the height, by the depth of the water depth. And of course, because that's clear because of continuity of mass, conservation of mass, the shallower the water becomes, the faster it has to swim. If I look at the perturbation of the surface waves, the propagation speed, that is directly proportional to the height of the flow. Now, looking back at the acoustic line element, what we see is here, this is G naught naught, GTT, if you want, and this is C squared propagation speed minus velocity, background velocity squared. So what we want to have a sine wave. First of all, we want to generate a region where these two are equal. Now, so by making the flow shallower, this thing becomes smaller, and these things become faster, and these things slows down. So you can easily set up already, conceptually, it is clear that you can easily set up regions where suddenly the background flow exceeds the propagation speed. So we set up this black and white horizon, we stimulate the system at the white horizon, and we measure what happens to these waves. That is our system. All the experiments have been done in an undergraduate laboratory at the civil engineering department, where the students usually learn how to study the Bernoulli equation, how to measure the depth and the flow velocities in this setup, in this room. So, this is a schematic drawing here. So here we have a water reservoir. We would fill it up the day before to have the water at room temperature. Then here water comes in. There's a water pump, pumps it in this reservoir here. There are some force meshes and so on to take out some turbulences. Because if you slow down the water here, you always have turbulences. Water comes in here. Here's our obstacle to change the depth of the flow. I will say a few words about the design of the obstacle. It's basically we modify the obstacle as much as needed to have irrotational flow. So on the back end of the flume there is a wave generator to stimulate the system. So, black and white on horizons. So first of all, what is a white horizon? A white horizon is the time reversal of the black horizon. So if you have a black horizon, everything can enter, but nothing can leave through a black horizon. On a white horizon, nothing can enter, but everything can leave. So if we now look at this setup here, the blue lines indicate the flow velocities, and the yellow dotted line are the upstream moving modes. The downstream moving mode is just downstream, they get very fast as the background flow is. The ones that have to counter-propagate now depend on, so I wanted to indicate these are the three different regions you get. So upstream of the obstacle, the water goes from the left to the right, of course. So you see here that the propagation speed of the surface waves in this area is larger than the background flow, so you can propagate upstream. Surface waves can propagate upstream. In this region here in between, we call this the critical region. The background flow speeds up, the surface waves slow down. So now the background flow exceeds the propagation speed of the surface waves, and they can not counter-propagate anymore. And then, of course, the water slows down again, and these things speed up. So what we see here, the surface wave can again propagate upstream. They can propagate upstream to this point. This point here, where nothing can enter, but everything coming from upstream can go down, we call the white horizon. And here, this thing here is where everything can enter, but nothing can leave. To this side, this is the effective black hole horizon. We design the obstacle in a particular way to avoid separation of flow. So if I have a laminar flow, a non-laminar flow would be that two flow layers would separate, one would form turbulences or eddies, the other would flow on top. This is from an old obstacle where you can see that here you have like some streamlines here. We put some small raisins into this flow, raising with particles with the same buoyancy as water. And then you can see these streaks because they're related to the lens is related to the sharpened diamond of the camera. And you can see here you have some separation of flow. This is what we want to avoid. So we designed the obstacle carefully with the shape. We started with some airplane shape, and then we modified it over and over again. This black top part in the middle is because if you have a black and a white hole horizon, right, and I say nothing can enter the white hole horizon, but it's in quantum mechanics, you can have some tunneling effects, so a wave can tunnel through. And of course it exponentially dies out with the depth of this region. So by adding this flat top part on the top, you further prevent quantum mechanical tunneling. So here you can see some particle sweep images of our experiment, and you see that there is almost one flow separation. So now you see a very old setup from our experiment. The waves we're actually sending in are about 1 millimeter high. This is just for demonstration reasons. So the wave generated at the back end of the channel, long wavelengths, roughly more than 10 times the depth of the flume of the height, are being sent upstream to a point where they suddenly cannot propagate anymore. This is where you can see is the effective white hole horizon. And the question is, what is happening to these waves here? Of course, the waves are very high, so this would be not an ideal thing. We would expect some back reactions, of course, so we could not run the experiment with these amplitudes. So the actual amplitudes are so small that when you look at it, you don't see them. So what we want to do is, we want to do field theory in this open channel flow. And the first thing, when you want to do field theory, you need to know the excitation spectrum. You need to know what kind of field theory is that. So let me start with that surface waves are neither longitudinal nor transversal waves, they are circular waves. They have in principle 3 different regimes. One is what's referred to as the shallow water waves, which I pointed out before, which are roughly 10 times the depth of the flow. And by those waves, the analogy is being derived. It's a linear dispersion relation. They all roughly propagate with the same propagation speed. If you come to shorter wavelengths, then you're in the so-called deep water regime, where you have subluminal dispersion relation. So their velocity depends on their wavelengths. And of course, if you go to very short wavelengths in the millimeter regime, then surface tension determines the effect of those other capillary waves. So we are interested in these 2 regimes. Here the analogy holds perfectly. Here already we have this deviation. So I plotted here the frequency of the wave number. So if you look at the dispersion relation, you have right and left moving modes. This is in an open channel with no obstacle, just water at rest. So there's no flow. And if you have a wave generator, of course, you produce right and left moving modes for a particular frequency. The dispersion equation tells you which wavelength you get. Now, if you have non-zero flow, then of course you get some sort of asymmetry between the down and the upstream moving modes. The downstream moving modes are now very fast and the upstream moving modes are slow. What I illustrated here, assuming some sort of WKV approximation because the depth is changing, but assuming again it's changing slowly, I can still talk about a plane wave here. Then you can see that I plotted this pair, the downstream and the upstream moving modes, for various heights in my open channel flow. And so you can see how throughout this picture dispersion relation is changing. Now, what is our observable? What are we really measuring? And it's the free surface. So we have green laser light, we have a power lens that generates a 2-dimensional laser light sheet. We have our water here, we put some luminescent dye there, rubidium type 6B dye. And what you can see, once the dye is in there, no light can penetrate through the free surface. So all you see is this thin line in the center here, and this is what we record. And we do all the analysis, that analysis with a slide which contains all the information about the amplitudes, the frequency, the wavelengths of these waves. So then I have to skip this a little bit, but what we do, we take 20, we have a high resolution megapixel camera. In a continuous mode, we take 20 frames a second. And in each one of this picture, we wrote some code in MATLAB to read in every picture. And from there, we get the free surface to sub-pixel resolution. We wrote our own routines for that. And the beautiful thing, what you can do with that, if you take an open channel flow with no obstacle, just some flow, I can take this, I can record 2,000 images, and this is just, it gives me a wave characteristic, so each image Here I see this free surface as a function of x. And then each image gives me an instant of time, so x over t, this is a wave characteristic. If you do a double Fourier transform, what you see here, you see there is, of course, as I said before, there's always classical noise in a channel. There's this classical noise, vibrations of the thumb. And of course, this noise has to sit on the branches of the dispersion relations. So what you see here is the kinematics of your excitations in this open channel flow. And what you can test, because here it is a one-dimensional flow, but of course you can also have, if you have a zero transversal component to the flow, then you get this first thing which I was discussing before. But because you have, if I look at my room here, right, and from this side, if I look at it, of course I can also have modes like that. So these are these transversal modes. And then of course what is beautifully seen, I think we're the first to see that you can see all these higher transversal modes. And you can compare that with the theorem, you can do, that's what we're doing now to test some fluid dynamics in detail. So what you can also see is that the noise we're seeing here is a tenth of a millimeter, so that precise, tens of hundreds of a millimeter, that accurately we can determine the amplitudes of these waves. So, that is our detection mechanism, our observable. Now our wave generator, I'm not sure if you can see that nicely here, is now instead of having this wedge, we just have a mesh, a wire, a metal wire, which goes in and out. So the waves produced are really tiny. And when you do the experiment, you cannot really see anything. You can only see these things by using this refined, especially developed for our experiment detection methods. Now what we did is, we said we stimulate the system because the more you send in, the more is coming out, the easier it is to detect this effect. Now what we're sending in, we're sending 9 different frequencies starting from 0.02 Hertz up to 1 Hertz, so we cover a broad range of frequencies. And we want to test for each one of these waves, when it propagates up to the Whitehead horizon, what is really happening to these waves. So, as before, for when we just tested the dispersion relation and all these things, we get these wave characteristics for all these various frequencies. And what I want to show you is how on each one of these data sets we do our data analysis. So first thing we do, let's focus on this typical, which really is the best data set for the typical, at 0.185 Hertz. And what you do first, you can do a double Fourier transform. And what you see is here, this thing here is just the background, right? This is related to omega equal k from 0 mode is just the height of the plume, the average height. And what you see here is a stimulated frequency band, and of course also you get it down here. So this is the frequency band which we stimulated, and here this is the noise in the channel. That's a typical noise. So, and what we can do, we can focus on that now, and we can say, so first of all, what we know from the dispersion relation, we send an upstream moving mode into the white hole. We send a long wavelength in. This is what we're sending in. And we got yet another pair of modes here, 2 peaks, which are now those two on the dispersion relation here. So the question is, where have those been created? Now what you can do is, you can, for example, take out the ingoing mode, and you can also take out everything else, the vacuum and so forth. And you just add in these 2 modes. And you see this is this checkerboard pattern which I showed you at the beginning. You see these modes I created somewhere here, which will be calculated exactly precisely where this effective Whitehead horizon sits. Now, more interesting, we can now also, of course, just focus on one of these peaks here. And we can see here is the one mode coming out, and this would be the other peak. So the idea is you filter everything, you set everything else to 0 in this in Fourier space, and then you do an inverse double Fourier transformation, and then you get a new wave characteristic where you remove everything except this signal. So what you see is here, these 2 things are classically correlated. Whenever I get one of these, I get one of that. What we can show later on, these in fact are the negative norm modes, and these are the positive norm modes because we can calculate this mode. What we can see is that these modes here, the negative norm modes, have a phase velocity, which you can see on the slope of this wave crest, is down downstream going, while the positive ones are upstream. However, the group velocity of both is going downstream, and this is why you see them here. How can you have a phase velocity pointing upstream and a group velocity downstream? This can be understood very easily by looking at this picture here. It's an old data set, old camera, really bad data, but it demonstrates one thing beautifully. When you send in a number of bursts of waves, and then you stop, you see here all these waves are going up, then you don't send anything anymore, but you see that the energy of these waves goes downstream, but at any instant its phase velocity is pointing upstream. So this is how it works. So what we've seen so far is that one wave comes into the white hole, gets converted there as a pair creation process, which is good, but that's not good enough. There might be many things that could be responsible for such an effect. So the next thing we need to do is we need to find out, is it really following a Boltzmann distribution? So what we need to do, the first thing we can do, we can look at the amplitudes of the converted waves depending on the ingoing frequency. So what I'm doing now from these various different data sets, I can just, this one band, I can just take this out and plot it to see the amplitudes. Because before the colors would indicate the amplitudes, now I can plot the directly. And what you see is here that for 0.02 Hertz, you can see this is here the converted one here, and this is the other one. For 0.19 Hertz, the purple one, here, and for 0.42 Hertz, the blue one. See here, there's much more converted to this side here, which is the positive normals, than to this one. Now, according to Hawking, this looks already very good, because according to him, he said, if I have a beta omega squared over alpha omega squared, this is x minus 2 pi omega over gh. Omega goes to 0, this should go to 1. The smaller omega, the more equally distributed should be between negative and positive non-modes. So if I look at that, indeed, if I look at the 0.02 mode, it's almost equally much converted to this peak here than to the other, as to the other. While if you go to higher and higher frequencies, ingoing frequencies, then of course this peak here becomes much larger than the other one. So roughly speaking, as a first indication, things look good. So let me now say the problems we have to get to the final result is the following. This is a stationary flow, so you send in a wave with a particular frequency. Its frequency will be conserved, which we see that it really lies completely on this one frequency band. If it would couple to other frequency bands, we would have some nonlinearities in the system. So, but what can change, because the depth of the flow is changing, is the wavelength. So while the wave is coming and is propagating towards this effective white horizon, its frequency stays the same, but its wavelength is changing. It has an effective wavelength. So the problem is, if you remember that these waves which are coming out of the white horizon, because now they're converted to deep water waves, they're unstable, they're dumped out. Luckily, they're dumped out both because they're roughly the same wavelength. The damping factor for them and for both are roughly the same. So that if I look at the ratio, it doesn't matter because the ratio just, if I e to the minus gamma, it's both the same, so it's just a factor of 1. So, but the problem is that you cannot, as in black holes, if you would look at black hole evaporation, infinitely far away from a black hole, you can have a flat background, you can define particles or waves nicely again. Here this is not possible because the wavelength is still changing, so we cannot just measure one peak. We have this coordinate peak, which is due to the fact that the wavelength is changing. So what we do instead, we say, well, we cannot really just measure these amplitudes, because I know that the waves, I cannot wait for it to come back to the flat part. I have to measure right at the white hole, around the white hole. So what we do, we calculate this conserved quantity, which I said before, the particle current, in this particular case, simplifies to the norm. And the norm is given by, it's just the amplitude squared, we do some coordinate change, so amplitude squared divided by frequency times wavelengths in these new coordinates. And when you do this, you can calculate what this quantity for everything here, but this hub here And for the other one, you can calculate for each one of them this norm and this, you can divide it, and then you can make a plot. You can plot the frequency over this quantity, you take the logarithm of it, and according to this formula, it should be on a straight line. Indeed, it is on a straight line. So now the last question we have to answer, is this straight line related by the effective surface gravity of the right-hand horizon? This is a bad plot here, but it's symbolizing. So you can calculate the surface gravity just with the background flow. The surface gravity is given by the normal derivative to c squared is the propagation square, which is just proportional to the height, minus v squared, which is inverse proportional to the height. So by measuring the flow, by measuring the height, you can calculate this quantity. And so we can calculate this quantity. These wiggles are not physical really. This is because we have to subtract the bottom and the bottom line. The way we take the bottom, we get these wiggles. That's an artifact of how we calculate that. So what you can see, you have zero inverse surface gravity upstream of the obstacle. Then here on the obstacle, you have non-zero gravity, and then here, of course, the surface gravity goes to zero. Now we can also calculate the surface gravity, take the surface gravity on the slope of this line, which is given by 0.2 Hertz. So we know, roughly speaking, we know where this effective right-hand horizon is. So by comparing these two values, we say, well, for the surface gravity, we get from the background, you get parameters between 0.08 to 0.118 Hertz, and the surface gravity for the excitation is about 0.12 Hertz. So, what we have seen is that this linear amplifier in this analog gravity system works very well here. Now, if it's a linear amplifier and it works at large amplitudes very well, the more you should trust it at lower amplitudes. Of course, what we haven't seen are any quantum correlations. So you can calculate the temperature. I can simply calculate my surface gravity and associate the temperature to it, and this temperature would be 10 to the minus 12 Hertz. 10 to the minus 12 Kelvin. So, in fact, and we calculated this now, in order to see any quantum correlation, you would have to cool down the system to this temperature. Which means, of course, you can never see any quantumness in any experiment like that. What we have seen is that apparently, also the system deviates a lot. This formula is universal. It survives all the differences. So we will never see the spontaneous emission. There are some experiments which claim they have seen some spontaneous emission, but they have to be treated carefully because they have not seen any of these things. And they claim there is some quantum effect, but it could not be shown any of these relations. So one of the things, and I'm basically done with this thing, I just want to see what is the future direction of where this field is going. So I think that in the next 5 to 10 years, analog gravity systems, we will see basically everything. We will also see quantum effects, and I'm very confident about that because there is already a first experiment by Chris Westbrook and his group in Paris, and they looked at parametrically excited Bose-Einstein condensates, and they showed that you get some quasi-particle production according to the prediction as we expected in a cyclic universe. I have to be a bit short on this, but already this cosmological particle production has been observed in the Bose-Einstein condensate. The surprising bit was Chris did this experiment, and he also looked at some witness, which is related to the violation of the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, to see if he gets some quantumness, if these quasi-particles are quantum correlated. And the answer was, at least this witness had a negative answer, they are not. And the reason was because when he started with this Bose-Einstein condensate, he started with a too high temperature. And what we are calculating, we're going to publish soon, is we're going to say we can put exact and precise thing we can calculate theoretical entanglement measures. I'm doing this with people working in quantum information in Nottingham, and we can calculate what this temperature is. And so the problem is, you might set up a very expensive experiment, which is down a Bose-Einstein condensate is 10 to the minus 6 Kelvin, and nevertheless, you end up with a classical result. There is no extra quantum correlations in your quasi-particles. So one of the things, of course, here, once you know, there are also some tricks maybe to get around that. So the next thing to do is to repeat this experiment in having this in mind and say, what I want to see entanglement in these quasi particles. And I think it is actually feasible to get there. So I would say in the next few years this is going to be seen. I'm also going to participate in some other experiment. Professor Peter Krüger, he's also setting up analog gravity experiment, analog gravity effects on an atom chip. So these are one-dimensional VSEs. And I'm very lucky he asked me to, we already applied for funding and so forth. So let's hope that we'll see some entanglement. And now I'm finishing last two slides. What we're doing right now in Trieste is a little bit less ambitious. We forget about entanglement again. What we want to look at rotating black holes. And in fact, every one of you has looked at an effective rotating black hole every time you take a bath. So all you need is for that is if you have, this is one of our first experiments just for fun. This is a water hose above the sink. We fill in water, continuously fill it up. And there's a hole, of course, at some point you get a stationary state. So you have stationary radiant water, which is referred to in fluid dynamics as a vast vortex flow. And you can show that there are two horizons. One is this ergosphere here, and you have inner horizon, so this black hole horizon. And you can show here that the ergosphere here basically is given when the total velocity of the background velocity is equal to the propagation speed of the surface waves, and that is given you have an angular and radial velocity. And the inner horizon here, the black hole horizon, is given when the radial component is equal to the propagation speed of the surface waves. So we said over the last 2 years, I put together a new team in collaboration with Professor Jonathan Geller, he's an expert in fluids and superfluids. We have now a team of 5-6 people working on this. And in fact, when I'm going back to Trieste, all the parts arrived. I will come back to this slide. This is how the experiment will look like. This is our flume. It is 3 meters long, 1.5 meters wide, half a meter high. So the way it works, water comes in these arms. There are some flow straighteners to take turbulences out. Water comes in here and here. This gives it the angular momentum. It drains through the center. And now we want to see if you send in a wave. You send in a wave with a particular amplitude, let's say 1. It falls into this ergosphere. It comes up with a higher particle current here, and you want to see this amplification process from the ingoing to the outgoing wave. So this is the process responsible to extract angular momentum from black holes. And we want to test the robustness of this effect, because also here, with this nonlinear dispersion relation, we could in principle also scatter to various different channels. So we want to see how robust is this process that black holes lose their angular momentum. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
Yeah, I have a very basic question which I didn't understand so well. I mean, you said you don't like this Hawking picture of these particles splitting there, and then one particle is falling to the black hole, the other one comes out. But in your picture, you viewed it as a wave coming into the black hole, if I understood correctly, and then the amplitude of the wave is amplified and more is coming out.
Right, but I'm measuring this amplitude. You see, I mean, basically what I'm saying is, it's the same as if you want to define a fixed particle. I can also not define a fixed wavelength, because the wavelength is changing. And in fact, if we come to the vital horizon, it's not a wave anymore, it's an Airy function. So I'm saying just, I don't know, excitation with respect to what. So I'm sending in a wave, I'm not looking at the horizon. I'm sending in something here where I say WKB, it's a wavelength with a field excitation with a particular wavelength.
This is outside the black hole.
It's outside. And I'm sending it in and I'm comparing what's coming out.
Yeah, but okay, but this is my basic understanding. Isn't there, I would have expected the wave goes in and disappears.
So
this is a black hole to me. So if you don't have a wave coming into a black hole, does black hole radiation work then?
Right.
If you don't have any waves outside, I mean, only this individual black holes, nothing else outside?
So two things. So the fact that in this particular case, every side, both modes end up outside the white hole horizon. That is due to the non-linear...
White hole or black hole horizon?
I mean, we are looking at the white hole horizon. And in this particular system,
Yes.
both modes end up outside the white hole horizon because of the non-linear dispersion relation. Because
Okay.
the group velocity of the ingoing mode gets actually turned around. So there are deviations. There are big deviations expected as, we don't expect that to be the way in a black hole, but this quantitative statement is robust. Now, if in a real black hole, and a black hole situation would be anyway very different to a white hole, but if in a black hole nothing would fall into the black hole, then there would be a question, where is it? Because then the mass of the black hole would not be reduced. Because right, and then you would say this process should not be happening, right? Because where would this energy come from? You're absolutely right. In this case here, because this is not a real black hole, it's just this effective horizon, the energy comes from the flow.
Yes, but the real black hole, would it evaporate then if there's nothing outside?
Then you would have to ask the question, where would the energy come from? I would say, it's a good question. Certainly it's something you need to think about, because how would this process be driven? But as I said, these analogs are different, they're very different. But
the analog, I seem to have understood the analog.
Right. No, but the thing is, you should not, some of the things you should not try to learn so much more about, this is not more universal than, if there would be some deviation, this does not necessarily teach you something really about black hole. It was just to show that this thing is very robust. This is the whole thing. There are some things which are certainly not robust, precisely that both modes end up on one side of the horizon. That is very different as you would expect it from a real white hole.
Yeah, but this discussion is about the classical fields, right? If you have quantum fields, then you always have a field present.
I know, of course.
So you can have the amplification effect.
But this is not the point. Because if I have a field, of course you have fields present, but if there's a field outside, if there's a quantum process, it would also suck them up, but both modes would end up outside the white hole. Then the negative particle current mode would not fall into it, and it cannot therefore reduce its mass.
For the white hole. Yep.
So this is the whole thing. You have to have some, because basically the particle current as a net process is conserved, but if I just consider what is falling into the black hole, that is lowering the mass of the black hole, because negative particle current acts like a source, sourcing this process.
Is it possible to find some new physics for black holes using your experiment?
So one thing which definitely is new is, there were a lot of, let's put it this way, when you start doing experiments, and you need to, what the most important thing is in these experiments we're doing is to figure out what are the essential features. And one of the things, for example, to realize that black holes also work at this, I would say, classical level, right? That you can stimulate the system and send more in. That is something which people weren't so much aware of. That, in some sense, one learned a lot about the fact that for Hawking radiation, you don't need to have the same dynamics, the overall dynamics, because it's not related, black hole entropy is related to the full dynamics, full Einstein equations. Hawking radiation is not. You just need to have the presence of these effective horizons. Then what we learned is this whole thing of a big question was, if you have a modified dispersion relation, where is the horizon? Is it the group or the phase will also be horizon? It was a big debate, and what these experiments basically showed, it should be the group velocity horizon. In our case, it is the group velocity horizon. What we've also seen is that another thing is, when does this conversion seems to take place? It's very difficult to say where precisely, right? Because it's a wave, it's a delocalized object. But if I look at these pictures, it seems very clearly like I see this line where they all originate. And these things actually seems to happen a bit earlier than one expected. That somehow, this is this non-adiabatic conversion of these modes coming in and gets converted to these two outgoing modes. The whole thing about this quantumness and that how much more fragile these quantum things are, initial temperature and so forth, these are all new things. So I would say I mean, I don't know if one can ever see real Hawking radiation, but all of these things we're learning here, they're certainly necessary to be understood before you really even think about it. It's more like, once you do an experiment, I worked on with Matt Visa was to see what can you get in terms of Kerr. And you can only get the equatorial slice. You cannot get full Kerr. But the equatorial slice is precisely the best thing because you have maximum distance between the ergosphere and the black hole horizon. And so you get the essential features. Then what we realized, what is actually necessary to see superradiance. And one of the things we realized, there are some analog gravity systems that have an ergosphere, but they don't have a black hole horizon. For example, a Bose-Einstein condensate with one vortex, a single vortex, there's no radial flow. But the angular velocities can become very high. So you can have, the angular velocity can exceed the propagation speed. But you never have an event horizon. So what we...
It's a reflected surface more or less there.
Yeah, so you can get instabilities or things like that. I mean, but these things are not sufficient to get superradiance. You need something that either takes out this negative norm or negative particle current mode or dissipates them away. So you really need a horizon. So some analog gravity systems seem less suitable than others. So this is because it has a grain. So this means really that this radial velocity you get a horizon. And recently now, it was accepted now, a few days ago, we worked on what happens if you have dispersive fields. Right, so what do you have if I have no linear dispersion relation? How will this affect what you have? Because now you don't, for example, in our surface wave case, you have shallow and deep water waves, and capillary waves and all this. So this gives you extra propagating degrees, extra scattering channels. And of course, you want to see if I also scatter maybe perhaps to these other channels, is the net thing which you convert to, is that, superradiated, is it amplified? And there are some, so basically, we studied that. Now we need to do the experiment to see if it really works. One problem is that you always have dissipation in the system. So the hope is that that is so small that that's what we want to test now. Can we still see it?
Thanks, Sylvia, again.